In the glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a corporation worth tens of billions of dollars, the woman behind the mahogany desk smiled with the kind of confidence that came from never once being told no. Across from her stood a man in a faded maintenance uniform, his hands folded calmly in front of him, his eyes steady despite the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on him. She leaned forward, savoring the moment the way a chess player savors the instant before checkmate, and let the words fall from her lips like a verdict already decided. If you think you are better than this company, then quit. Nobody in that room believed he would actually do it. Whispers rippled through the rows of executives, phones lowered halfway, pens paused mid-note, because surely this was another empty threat meant to humble a man who had grown too comfortable in his position. But then, something happened that nobody expected. He reached up, unclipped his badge from his chest, and set it gently on the table between them. He folded his uniform jacket with the precision of a man packing for a long journey, not a short one, and he began to empty the contents of an old steel locker that had sat in the basement for longer than most people in that room had worked there. He did not apologize. He did not explain himself. 10 minutes later, an entire $2 billion network began to falter, servers flickering, systems groaning under a weight nobody else understood how to carry, and only then did the billionaire in the tailored suit realize that the man she had just dismissed had never been an ordinary employee at all. Long before that morning in the conference room, Malcolm had built a life defined by quiet discipline rather than public ambition, a life shaped by lessons he had learned watching his own father rise before dawn to work jobs that never once earned him the gratitude he deserved. He had studied engineering on a partial scholarship, working nights to cover the difference, and he had graduated without the connections or family wealth that so many of his eventual colleagues took for granted. Rather than chase prestige at firms with recognizable names, he had accepted a modest position at a small startup that would one day become Atlas Dynamics, drawn by the challenge of building something entirely from scratch. He raised a daughter largely on his own after losing his wife to illness when the girl was still small, and the discipline that had carried him through those difficult years followed him into every corner of his professional life. Malcolm Carter was 42 years old, a black man who had spent nearly 2 decades keeping the technological heart of a company alive without ever asking for recognition. He held the title of Head of Systems Maintenance at Atlas Dynamics, a technology conglomerate that had grown from a modest startup into an industry titan, and he arrived every morning before the sun had fully risen over the city skyline. He was a quiet man by nature, the kind who listened more than he spoke, who never involved himself in the political games that consumed so many of his colleagues, and who never once bragged about what he knew. To the younger employees who rode the elevator with him each morning, he was simply the man who fixed things when they broke, a background figure in pressed coveralls whose name most of them had never bothered to learn. What none of them understood, what none of them could have understood, was that Malcolm knew the architecture of that company's entire technological infrastructure more intimately than anyone else who had ever set foot in the building, including the engineers with diplomas from prestigious universities hanging on their office walls. Victoria Harrington was 38 years old when she was appointed as the new chief executive following a sweeping acquisition that had reshaped the company's leadership from the top down. She was sharp in the way that intimidated people who mistook cruelty for confidence, decisive in meetings where others hesitated, and she carried an unshakable belief that spreadsheets told the truth in ways that human experience never could. She trusted graduate degrees and quarterly reports over decades of hands-on knowledge, and she had built her reputation on the idea that sentiment had no place in business decisions. Within her first month in the role, she set her sights on trimming costs across every department that did not directly generate revenue, and the maintenance division, quiet and unassuming as it was, became an easy target for her ambitions. To Victoria, men like Malcolm represented an outdated model of corporate loyalty, one she intended to replace with efficiency, automation, and her own particular brand of modern leadership. In her first address to the senior staff, she stood at the head of the very table where Malcolm would later leave his badge, and she promised the room that she intended to change everything. The first confrontation came only weeks later, in a meeting hall filled with department heads and regional managers who had gathered to hear Victoria's plans for the coming fiscal year. Malcolm stood before them with a folder of technical reports, his voice measured and unhurried, and he explained that the backup server systems responsible for protecting the company's most sensitive data were showing early signs of failure. He warned that continuing to slash the maintenance budget would leave the entire network exposed to a catastrophic collapse, the kind that could not be undone with an apology or a press release. Victoria listened with a faint smile curling at the corner of her mouth, and when he finished speaking, she turned to the room and delivered her verdict with practiced ease. Fear, she said, was simply the tool that long-tenured employees used to protect their own job security, a manipulation dressed up as expertise. Laughter rippled through the room, quiet but unmistakable, the kind of laughter that told a man exactly where he stood in the eyes of his colleagues. Malcolm said nothing in response, his jaw tight but his composure unbroken, while somewhere in the back rows a junior analyst felt her stomach twist with second-hand embarrassment on his behalf. By the end of that meeting, Victoria had ordered the cancellation of the entire scheduled maintenance plan, effective immediately, with no further discussion permitted. In the weeks that followed, Victoria brought in an outside consulting firm known throughout the industry for its aggressive automation strategies, a team of confident young analysts who promised that artificial intelligence could replace the entire maintenance division at a fraction of the cost. They walked the halls of Atlas Dynamics with tablets in hand, speaking in the language of disruption and optimization, and they assured Victoria that human oversight of the server infrastructure was an unnecessary relic of an older, slower era. Malcolm attempted to explain, calmly and without malice, that the consultants had not yet grasped the full complexity of a system that had been built and rebuilt over the course of 15 years, layered with custom solutions that existed nowhere in any manual or textbook. Nobody in leadership cared to listen. Some of his younger colleagues, eager to align themselves with the new regime, began to mock him openly in the break room, telling him that his era of relevance had quietly come to an end. Malcolm absorbed the comments without protest, and in the evenings after his official shift ended, he began quietly backing up every piece of technical documentation he had ever written, compiling detailed handoff notes that explained the reasoning behind every safeguard he had built into the system over the years. Nobody noticed what he was doing, because nobody thought to look. The breaking point arrived during a tense afternoon meeting, when tempers had already been worn thin by weeks of mounting pressure over a delayed product launch. Victoria stood at the head of the table once more, her patience for what she considered outdated resistance finally exhausted, and she said the words that would come to define the months that followed. If Malcolm believed himself so indispensable, so critical to the survival of a company worth billions of dollars, then perhaps he should simply resign and let someone else prove him wrong. The room fell utterly silent, the kind of silence that presses against the chest, and every eye in the room turned toward Malcolm, waiting for him to soften, to apologize, to do whatever it took to keep his position secure the way most people would have. Instead, he looked at her steadily and said only one word: "Fine." He rose from his chair without a trace of anger in his movements, and he began to gather his things, while the room watched in stunned disbelief, certain that this was theater, a bluff meant to shame Victoria into backing down. Victoria simply smiled wider, utterly convinced that no man in his position would actually walk away from a paycheck like his. But Malcolm was not bluffing, and everyone in that building would soon understand exactly how serious he had been. He signed the resignation papers without hesitation, his signature steady and unshaking, and he returned his employee identification card to Human Resources, along with every set of keys that had been entrusted to him over the years. He handed over binders of documentation, organized meticulously by system and by date, offering a complete and generous accounting of everything he had ever built or maintained within those walls. He did not argue with anyone on his way out, and he did not offer a single word of blame toward the woman who had pushed him to this point. A quiet unease began to spread among a handful of employees who understood, even if only vaguely, that an extraordinary number of critical processes existed solely inside Malcolm's memory and nowhere else in any official record. The head of the information technology department flipped through emergency contact sheets and realized with a creeping dread that Malcolm's name appeared as the sole point of contact for systems nobody else had ever been trained to touch. Victoria, for her part, remained unmoved, repeating to anyone who would listen that no single individual, however skilled, could ever be more important than the institution itself. When Malcolm walked out through the glass doors of Atlas Dynamics for the final time, he did not look back, and the late afternoon sun caught the edge of his shoulder as he disappeared into the flow of the city street. 2 hours later, disaster arrived exactly as Malcolm had warned it would, though far faster and far more violently than anyone had prepared for. The primary data storage system began throwing errors across every department simultaneously, a cascading failure that spread through the network like a fever moving through a body with no immune defense left to fight it. The servers responsible for synchronizing client information across regional offices failed one after another, each collapse triggering the next in a chain reaction. Nobody in the building understood how to interrupt. Customers around the world found themselves locked out of their accounts entirely, unable to access services they had paid for and depended upon. And within the hour, the company's entire network of data centers had begun sounding alarms that echoed through empty server rooms with nobody qualified left to silence them. The outside consulting firm, so confident only weeks earlier, proved utterly incapable of diagnosing a system they had never truly understood in the first place, their tablets and dashboards useless against a crisis rooted in 15 years of custom architecture. Victoria, watching the chaos unfold on the screens lining the executive floor, felt the first genuine flicker of panic she had experienced since stepping into her role. For the first time since the confrontation that had sent Malcolm walking out of the building, she asked the question that had been quietly avoided by everyone around her. "Where is Malcolm?" The answer came back from a dozen different mouths in a dozen different tones, all carrying the same devastating simplicity. "He resigned. He is gone." During those chaotic first hours of the outage, a young woman named Emma Rodriguez, one of the few junior engineers who had ever taken the time to learn from Malcolm directly, sat in the war room watching senior consultants argue over diagnostic screens that meant nothing to them. She remembered a rainy afternoon months earlier when Malcolm had walked her patiently through the logic behind one of the system's more obscure failsafes, explaining not just what it did but why it mattered, treating her curiosity as worthy of his time when so many others had dismissed her questions as a waste of theirs. She raised her hand cautiously in a room full of executives twice her age and suggested, her voice trembling slightly, that someone attempt to reach him directly, rather than continuing to guess at solutions nobody in that room possessed the knowledge to implement. Her suggestion was waved away twice before an exhausted vice president finally relented near midnight, dialing a number pulled from an old internal directory that nobody had bothered to update. Malcolm did not answer that first call, and the ringing phone sat abandoned on a desk, while the crisis continued to spiral through server rooms 4 floors below. In the days that followed, as the crisis deepened and shareholders began demanding answers nobody in leadership could provide, the board of directors launched an internal investigation into exactly how the company had found itself so catastrophically unprepared. What they uncovered left several senior executives sitting in stunned silence around a conference table that suddenly felt far too large for the weight of what they had just learned. The man they had allowed to walk out the door, the man Victoria had dismissed as replaceable, had in fact designed the majority of the company's core technological architecture nearly 15 years earlier, back when Atlas Dynamics had been a fraction of its current size. Malcolm had turned down offers from far larger and more prestigious corporations during those early years, choosing instead to stay and build something from the ground up with his own 2 hands, driven by a quiet ambition that had nothing to do with prestige or public recognition. Deeper still, the investigation revealed that a significant number of the company's internal patents, the very innovations that had given Atlas Dynamics its competitive edge in the marketplace, bore the unmistakable technical fingerprints of his work, even though his name had rarely appeared on the official paperwork. Victoria sat frozen at the head of the table as the reports were read aloud, the color draining slowly from her face as the full scope of her miscalculations settled over her like a physical weight. For the first time in her career, she understood with absolute clarity that she had misjudged a human being in a way that no spreadsheet could ever have warned her about. Desperate and running out of options, Victoria made the decision to drive to Malcolm's location herself, rather than send an assistant or a recruiter to handle the delicate task of reaching out. She found him at a small technical repair shop on the outskirts of the city, working under a short-term contract for a modest hourly wage, his sleeves rolled up as he repaired a piece of equipment with the same quiet focus he had once brought to a company worth billions. She offered him everything she believed a man in his position could possibly want: a full return to his former role, a salary tripled from what he had earned before, and a title elevated far beyond anything he had previously held within the organization. Malcolm listened patiently, wiping his hands on a cloth before setting down his tools, and when she finished speaking, he shook his head slowly and gave her an answer she had not prepared herself to hear. He told her plainly that he had not walked away because of money, and that no amount of money now would change what had already been broken. He told her that he had left because of his dignity, because there was a point past which a man could no longer accept being humiliated in front of people who owed him more respect than they had ever shown. For the first time since she had taken the reins of Atlas Dynamics, Victoria offered an apology that came not from the mouth of a chief executive managing a crisis, but from a woman who was beginning, slowly and uncomfortably, to see her own reflection more honestly than she ever had before. Over the course of several long conversations that followed in the weeks after that first meeting at the repair shop, Victoria began to understand something about Malcolm that no report or resume could have ever conveyed to her. He had never wanted power for its own sake, had never craved a corner office or a title that would impress strangers at industry dinners. All he had ever wanted was for the work to be done correctly, for the systems he had built with such care to be respected and maintained by people who understood what was actually at stake when those systems failed. Together, slowly, and with considerable resistance from certain corners of the boardroom, they began re-examining the entire culture that had taken root within the company under the previous wave of leadership decisions. Victoria terminated the contract with the outside consulting firm that had promised so much and delivered so little, and she began the long process of rebuilding the technical team that had been so carelessly dismantled. She made a point of ensuring that the people who actually created value within the company, the engineers and technicians who kept the invisible machinery running, were given the authority and respect their expertise had always warranted. Malcolm eventually agreed to return, though not without conditions of his own that Victoria accepted without argument this time. He insisted that every future technical decision be grounded firmly in expertise and evidence, never again in ego or the desire to appear decisive for its own sake. A year passed, and the transformation that had begun in the wreckage of that catastrophic outage had reshaped Atlas Dynamics into something none of its employees would have recognized 12 months earlier. The company emerged as a leader within its industry once more, its systems more resilient than ever, its reputation for reliability restored through the quiet, unglamorous labor of people who had finally been given the credit they deserved. During a shareholder meeting attended by investors, employees, and members of the press, Victoria stood before the assembled crowd and delivered a public apology that surprised even those who had worked closely with her throughout the crisis. She told them plainly that the person who had truly saved Atlas Dynamics from ruin had not been her, despite whatever narrative might have circulated in the months following the collapse. She told them it had been the very man she had once believed could be replaced without consequence, the man she had dismissed with a careless challenge in a room full of witnesses. Malcolm was elevated to the position of Chief Infrastructure Officer, a title that finally reflected the true weight of the responsibility he had carried in silence for so many years. In the months that followed, something quiet and unexpected began to grow between the two of them, a mutual respect that had been forged in the fire of genuine humility rather than convenience or proximity. It was not born from status or position, but from the fact that both of them had been forced to grow, painfully and honestly, in the aftermath of a mistake that could have destroyed everything. One evening, as the two of them walked together through the same marble lobby where Malcolm had once folded his uniform and handed over his badge, Victoria finally asked the question that had lingered in her mind since the day the servers first began to fail. She asked him what might have happened if she had never issued that reckless challenge, if she had never dared him to walk away in front of an entire room of witnesses who expected him to fold. Malcolm smiled, the same calm, unshaken smile he had worn on the day he packed his locker without a single word of protest, and he told her that she might never have discovered who was truly holding the entire company together behind the scenes. The story closed on the image of the two of them crossing that same lobby together, no longer executive and subordinate, but equals who had earned their standing through hard-won understanding rather than hierarchy or title. It was a quiet reminder, carried in the sound of their footsteps against the marble floor, that the greatest asset any company could ever possess was never its technology or its balance sheet, but the people within it who possessed both the skill and the character to be trusted when everything else began to fall apart. In the months before the collapse, few people had taken the time to notice the small rituals that defined Malcolm's daily routine, the quiet order he brought to a building that ran on chaos disguised as ambition. He arrived each morning while the lobby was still dim, greeted the overnight security guard by name, and made his rounds through the server rooms before most executives had even poured their first cup of coffee. He kept a small notebook in his breast pocket, its pages filled with handwritten notes about systems that had no official documentation anywhere else in the company, a private ledger of knowledge accumulated across 15 patient years. He never once mentioned this notebook to anyone, not out of secrecy, but simply because nobody had ever asked him what he carried with him each day. When younger engineers came to him with problems they could not solve, he would walk them through the solutions step by step, never taking credit, never mentioning that he had built the very system they were struggling to understand in the first place. It was this quiet generosity, this willingness to teach without demanding recognition, that had earned him the loyalty of the handful of colleagues who did take the time to see him clearly. In the years before Victoria arrived at Atlas Dynamics, Malcolm had quietly become something of a legend among the small circle of engineers who understood the true scope of his contributions, even if the wider company never fully recognized it. He had once spent 3 consecutive nights inside the primary data center during a regional storm that threatened to knock out power to an entire block of the city, manually rerouting critical systems to prevent the kind of collapse that would eventually occur under Victoria's leadership. He never filed for overtime during those nights, never mentioned the ordeal to anyone outside the small team who had worked alongside him, and the incident faded quietly into the unofficial folklore of the maintenance department. A previous chief executive, long since retired, had once offered him a formal promotion to a leadership role with a corner office and a title that would have finally matched his contributions, but Malcolm had turned it down, explaining simply that he preferred working close to the machines rather than close to the politics. That decision, made years before Victoria ever set foot in the building, had left him vulnerable in a way he never anticipated, invisible to a new generation of executives who measured worth entirely by titles and org charts rather than by the quiet evidence of dependable work. Victoria's ascension to the role of chief executive had come with considerable fanfare, her face appearing in business publications that praised her as a bold new voice for a new era of corporate leadership. She had built her early career on a series of aggressive restructurings at smaller companies, each one praised by analysts for its efficiency even as the human costs of those decisions faded quietly into the background of quarterly earnings calls. She arrived at Atlas Dynamics with a mandate from the board to modernize an organization they considered too comfortable, too settled in its ways, and she interpreted that mandate as license to dismantle anything that did not immediately justify itself in the language of numbers. She surrounded herself with advisors who reinforced her instincts rather than challenging them, young executives eager to please a woman who controlled their futures within the company. It was this insulated environment, this echo chamber of ambition, that made it so easy for her to dismiss Malcolm's warnings as the anxious mutterings of a man clinging to relevance in a changing world. She had never once considered that the quiet man in the maintenance uniform might understand the company's future better than any consultant she had hired to reassure her. The consulting firm Victoria brought in called themselves pioneers of digital transformation, a phrase they repeated so often in their presentations that it began to lose all meaning to anyone who sat through more than one of their meetings. They arrived with polished slide decks filled with projected savings and efficiency gains, numbers that looked impressive in isolation but crumbled under any scrutiny of the underlying assumptions. Their lead consultant was a confident young man, barely 30 years old, had never once worked inside a legacy system as complex as the one Malcolm had spent 15 years building, yet he spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who believed complexity was simply a problem waiting to be automated away. When Malcolm attempted to walk him through the custom fail-safes embedded throughout the network, safeguards designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic failure that would eventually occur, the consultant nodded politely without truly listening, already composing his next slide in his mind. This dismissiveness was not born of malice so much as a kind of willful blindness, a belief that experience gathered through actual labor could never compete with the authority of a well-formatted spreadsheet. It was a blindness that Victoria shared completely, and one that would cost the company more than either of them could have imagined in those early weeks of the transition. When the servers finally began to fail, the unraveling did not happen all at once, but in a series of escalating alarms that grew more desperate with each passing hour. The first sign of trouble appeared as a minor synchronization error in the customer database, the kind of glitch that would ordinarily have been caught and corrected automatically by safeguards Malcolm had built into the system years earlier. Without anyone left who understood how to diagnose the failure, the error spread unchecked into the backup systems designed to protect against exactly this scenario. Systems that had been quietly stripped of their maintenance schedule under Victoria's cost-cutting directive. Within 3 hours, regional offices across 4 continents reported that clients could no longer access their accounts, and customer service lines lit up with complaints faster than any team could field them. The consulting firm's engineers gathered in a war room on the 30th floor, staring at diagnostic screens filled with error codes they had no framework to interpret, their confidence evaporating with every passing minute. Somewhere in that chaos, a junior technician who had once shadowed Malcolm during a routine inspection remembered a phrase he used to repeat, a warning about the fragility of systems nobody had bothered to document properly. It was this young technician who first suggested, quietly and almost apologetically, that perhaps someone should try reaching Malcolm directly, no matter how awkward that phone call might be. The investigation that followed the crisis was more thorough than anything the board of directors had commissioned in years, driven by shareholders who demanded to understand exactly how a company worth billions of dollars had nearly collapsed in a single afternoon. Investigators pulled records dating back over a decade, tracing the origins of critical systems through old project files and internal memos that had been buried in digital archives nobody had opened in years. What emerged from those records was a portrait of a man who had quietly shaped the technological backbone of an entire industry-leading corporation, often working through nights and weekends that nobody else had witnessed or acknowledged. They found early emails from competing firms, offers of positions with salaries that would have made him wealthy many times over. All of them declined in favor of continuing work he considered unfinished. They found patent filings where his name appeared only as a secondary contributor, his most significant innovations attributed instead to managers who had simply signed off on paperwork he had done the actual work to create. The board members who reviewed these findings sat in uncomfortable silence, understanding that the company's entire success had rested for years on the shoulders of a man they had allowed to be humiliated and discarded without a second thought. Victoria's drive to the repair shop on the outskirts of the city took nearly an hour, giving her ample time to rehearse words that ultimately failed her the moment she stepped through the door and saw him working quietly at a bench covered in scattered tools. The shop smelled of solder and machine oil, a world away from the polished glass and steel of the executive floor she had grown accustomed to, and for a moment she felt entirely out of place standing in the doorway. Malcolm looked up without surprise, as though he had expected this visit long before it arrived, and he set down the device he had been repairing with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything he did. She began with an offer, because offers were the language she understood best, promising him a return to his old position, with compensation that would have seemed unthinkable only months earlier. He let her finish before responding, never interrupting, and when he finally spoke, his words carried none of the bitterness she had braced herself to receive. He told her that money had never been the reason he stayed all those years, and money could not repair what had been broken in that conference room when she dared him to prove his worth in front of an audience. During one of their early conversations at the small diner near the repair shop, Victoria asked Malcolm why he had never once fought back publicly during the months of ridicule he endured from the consulting team and the younger employees eager to please her. He set down his coffee and explained that fighting back would have required him to prove his worth to people who had already decided not to see it. A battle he had long ago concluded was not worth the energy it demanded. He told her about his daughter, now a young woman studying medicine at a university several states away, and how he had built his entire quiet, careful life around giving her opportunities he himself had never been given. He explained that dignity, for a man who had spent his whole life being underestimated, was not something loud or dramatic, but something steady, something he carried with him regardless of who acknowledged it. Victoria listened without interrupting, feeling for the first time in years the discomfort of realizing that her own definition of strength had been shallow compared to the quiet endurance sitting across the table from her. The conversations that followed over the subsequent weeks took place not in boardrooms, but in quieter settings, a small diner near the repair shop, a bench in a park where Malcolm sometimes ate his lunch, places far removed from the performative atmosphere of corporate life. Victoria found herself listening more than she spoke, a habit entirely foreign to a woman who had built her career on commanding every room she entered. She learned that Malcolm had grown up watching his father work multiple jobs to support their family, instilling in him a deep respect for labor that went unnoticed and unrewarded by those who benefited from it most. She learned that his decision to stay at Atlas Dynamics all those years had never been about loyalty to the company itself, but about a personal commitment to finishing what he had started, to seeing his work protect the people who depended on systems they would never understand. Slowly, painfully, she began to recognize the ways her own assumptions about competence and value had been shaped by degrees and titles, rather than by the quieter evidence of consistent, careful work. It was a humbling process, one that stripped away the certainty she had carried into every meeting since her appointment, replacing it with a more fragile but more honest understanding of what leadership actually required. When Malcolm finally agreed to return to Atlas Dynamics, he did so only after Victoria had demonstrated, through concrete action rather than promises, that the culture within the company was genuinely shifting. She dissolved the contract with the consulting firm publicly, taking full responsibility for the decision to bring them in rather than deflecting blame onto the board that had approved the arrangement. She reinstated the maintenance budget in full, then expanded it, insisting that technical staff be given the resources and respect their work had always deserved but rarely received. She personally reviewed every patent filing from the past decade, working with legal counsel to ensure that credit was properly attributed to the engineers who had actually done the work, including Malcolm himself. These changes did not happen overnight, and they were met with resistance from board members who preferred the old model of centralized authority and minimized labor costs. But Victoria pushed forward with a determination that surprised even those who had known her longest, driven by a conviction that had not existed in her before the crisis forced her to confront the limits of her own judgment. Word of what had happened at Atlas Dynamics eventually spread beyond the company itself, reaching business schools, where professors began using the story as a case study in the dangers of undervaluing institutional knowledge in favor of theoretical efficiency. Analysts who had once praised Victoria's aggressive early decisions now wrote about her recovery as an even more impressive achievement, noting that admitting a catastrophic misjudgment publicly required a different kind of courage than the confidence she had once displayed so easily. Other executives, watching from competing firms, quietly reviewed their own maintenance budgets and technical staffing decisions, unwilling to risk a similar collapse within their own organizations. Malcolm received invitations to speak at industry conferences, most of which he declined politely, preferring to let his rebuilt team and its steady, reliable systems speak for themselves rather than standing before crowds to recount his own vindication. The few times he did agree to speak, he focused not on his own experience but on the broader principle he believed mattered most, that the people closest to the actual work almost always understood its risks and its value better than those who only observed it from a distance. The year that followed brought a transformation to Atlas Dynamics that extended far beyond the technical infrastructure Malcolm had rebuilt with painstaking care. Employee morale, which had quietly deteriorated under the previous regime of cost-cutting and dismissiveness, began to recover as workers across every department felt the shift in how their contributions were valued. New hires arrived to find a maintenance and infrastructure team treated not as a background necessity but as the essential backbone of the entire operation, a reputation that spread quickly through industry circles. Competing companies began reaching out to Atlas Dynamics, not to poach its talent, but to study how it had managed to recover so completely from a crisis that had nearly destroyed it. Malcolm, now serving as Chief Infrastructure Officer, built a mentorship program for young engineers, ensuring that the knowledge locked away in his private notebook for so many years would finally be passed on rather than lost. He no longer worked in silence, no longer carried the full weight of the company's technological survival on his shoulders alone, and something in the way he moved through the building suggested a man who had finally been allowed to exhale after 15 years of quiet vigilance. In the weeks leading up to that meeting, Victoria spent considerable time drafting and redrafting her remarks, discarding versions that felt too polished, too carefully engineered to protect her own image, rather than to tell the truth plainly. She consulted no communication strategist, wanting the words to come from her own understanding rather than from a team hired to manage public perception. She thought often of the moment Malcolm had folded his uniform jacket without a trace of anger, a memory that had come to represent everything she had gotten wrong about leadership during her early months in the role. She also thought of her own mentors, executives who had taught her that vulnerability was a weakness to be hidden rather than a truth to be shared, and she made a conscious decision to reject that lesson entirely. On the morning of the meeting, she stood in front of a mirror in her office for a long moment, straightening her jacket the way she had seen Malcolm straighten his own uniform on the day he walked out, and something about that small gesture steadied her nerves. The shareholder meeting where Victoria delivered her public apology drew far more attention than anyone at Atlas Dynamics had anticipated, with journalists and industry analysts filling seats usually reserved for routine financial disclosures. She stood at the podium without notes, having decided in the days beforehand that this particular truth deserved to be spoken plainly rather than read from a script prepared by her communications team. She described in careful detail the mistake she had made in undervaluing the contributions of the people who did the unglamorous work of keeping a massive organization running smoothly. She named Malcolm specifically, describing not just his technical brilliance but his integrity, his refusal to compromise his dignity, even when threatened with the loss of his livelihood. The room fell into a silence different from the one that had once followed her challenge to him in that conference room, a silence born of genuine respect rather than fear or amusement. When she finished speaking, the applause that followed was not the polite courtesy extended to routine corporate announcements, but something warmer, something that suggested the people in that room understood they had witnessed a genuine reckoning. In the quiet months that followed the public apology, Victoria and Malcolm found themselves working closely together on projects that required both her strategic vision and his technical mastery, a partnership neither of them could have predicted during the tense weeks of their initial confrontation. Their conversations, once confined to crisis management and damage control, gradually expanded into discussions about the future of the industry, about innovations neither of them could have pursued alone. Colleagues who observed them together noticed a shift in Victoria's demeanor, a softness that had not been present during her early months as chief executive, replaced by a groundedness that seemed to come from having been proven fundamentally wrong about something she once considered certain. Malcolm, for his part, remained the same quiet, unassuming man he had always been, though those who knew him well could see a lightness in him that had not existed when he carried his responsibilities entirely alone. Neither of them spoke openly at first about the affection that had begun to grow between them, aware that any acknowledgement would need to wait until the professional wounds between them had fully healed, but those closest to them could sense it building slowly, in the way Victoria's schedule seemed to accommodate more meetings with the infrastructure team than strictly necessary, in the way Malcolm began arriving a few minutes later than his usual pre-dawn hour, no longer needing to prove anything to anyone. It was on an ordinary evening, long after most of the building's staff had gone home for the day, that Victoria and Malcolm found themselves walking together through the same marble lobby where their story had first taken its painful turn. The late light through the tall windows cast long shadows across the floor, and their footsteps echoed in a space that had once felt cold and impersonal to both of them in different ways. Victoria broke the comfortable silence first, asking the question that had lingered in the back of her mind since the day the servers first began to fail beneath the weight of her own miscalculation. She wanted to know what might have happened, what might have become of the company and of the two of them, if she had never issued that reckless dare in front of an audience who expected him to yield. Malcolm considered the question for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the golden light spilling through the windows, before he answered with the same calm certainty that had defined him since the very beginning of their acquaintance. He told her that, without that moment, she might never have discovered who was truly holding the company together in the quiet hours nobody else bothered to witness, and that some lessons could only be learned through the cost of nearly losing everything. Emma Rodriguez, the young engineer whose quiet suggestion had gone ignored during the darkest hour of the crisis, was among those Malcolm chose to mentor personally once he returned to lead the rebuilt infrastructure team. He never mentioned publicly that her voice had been the first to suggest reaching out to him, but he made certain she was given opportunities to grow that reflected the courage she had shown when nobody else in that room had been willing to speak. Under his guidance, she rose quickly through the ranks, eventually taking on responsibilities that would have seemed unimaginable to her during those anxious early days answering phones in a chaotic war room. She often told newer hires that the culture at Atlas Dynamics had changed because two people, in their own separate ways, had chosen humility over pride when it mattered most. The story closed not with grand declarations or dramatic flourishes, but with the simple, steady image of two people crossing a familiar lobby side by side, no longer bound by the hierarchy that had once defined their every interaction. They had become equals in every sense that mattered, partners who had earned their standing through genuine understanding rather than the accident of title or position. Their footsteps against the marble floor carried a rhythm that felt, for the first time, entirely unforced, the sound of two people who trusted one another completely. Somewhere above them, the servers that Malcolm had built and rebuilt hummed quietly in their climate-controlled rooms, protected now by a team that finally understood the value of the work being done. The company that had nearly collapsed under the weight of arrogance and misplaced confidence now stood as an example within its industry, a reminder that no algorithm or spreadsheet could ever replace the judgment earned through years of honest, careful labor. And as Victoria and Malcolm stepped out into the evening air together, the city lights beginning to flicker on around them, it was clear to anyone watching that the greatest asset any organization could ever possess was never its technology or its balance sheet, but the people within it who carried both the skill and the character to be trusted when everything else threatened to fall apart.